So now let's begin. Once again, thank you for joining us this Friday morning. We have with us Prof. Eric Thompson from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology from NUS. He'll be speaking to us regarding Singapore's place in ASEAN. This talk is organized in conjunction with the establishment of the ASEAN Corner at NUS Libraries. So what's the ASEAN Corner about? Basically, it provides authoritative information about ASEAN through digital resources comprising books and these materials in the slide here, pertaining to economic, political, security, and socio-cultural aspects. And there's a digital archive at a dedicated computer terminal, and there's a display of our collection of print resources related to ASEAN. All right, just stay with us. At the end, I will share with you how you can redeem your tote bag. Thank you for attending the session. Right, but for now, I'll hand over the time to Prof. Thompson to share that with us his talk. Prof. Thompson, please.
All right, thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. Give me 1 minute. All right, there, that should be the correct screen. Okay. So I want to thank the library for inviting me to give this presentation related to the basically the ASEAN corner that the library has in I think it's actually in the Malaysia Singapore collection actually area. So if you're in the library, you want to have a look at it. It's a sort of a collection of books and things specifically on ASEAN. And so for the talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Singapore's place in ASEAN. So, and how Singapore relates more generally to the region, to Southeast Asia. So let me see. Right. So in the talk today, what I'm going to talk about mainly is about thinking about Singapore as a Southeast Asian society. And there's a kind of question that arises in terms of Singapore that I'm going to go into in some detail in the talk. And that is whether Singapore is in Southeast Asia, like we sort of obviously know that geographically it's located in Southeast Asia, but is Singapore as a society of Southeast Asia? Is it part of Southeast Asia? I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that when I get into the talk. And what I'm going to do is give some historical perspectives on this. And I'm going to kind of make an argument for how and why Singapore is very much a Southeast Asian society, even though in some respects, people, especially within Singapore, often don't really think of Singapore as being Southeast Asian. And again, I'll explain what I mean by that as I go through the talk. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about Singapore's role in Southeast Asia, or I mean within ASEAN, within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and then some of the sort of aspects of Singapore's future within ASEAN and within Southeast Asia. So that's the general themes that I'm going to be covering today. So let me give just a little bit of my own background and how I come to be giving this particular talk. So my specialization, my discipline is anthropology. I'm in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at NUS, and I've been here since 2001. So actually 20 years now, a little over 20 years now, that I've been working here in Singapore specifically. Before that, in the 1990s, basically for all of the decade of the 1990s, I was a graduate student at the University of Washington, and I did my dissertation research about Malaysia, specifically about rural Malaysia and the transformation of rural Malaysia as Malaysia itself became an increasingly urban society. So that was, I mean, part of my reason and interest in coming to work at NUS, other than just the fact of it being a very good university generally, is because my research specialization has been on Southeast Asia, starting with Malaysia. So this is an excellent, superb place, especially professionally, to be and to work and so forth. And it's also being at NUS over the last 20 years has afforded me a real opportunity to then continue to do work and to expand work across Southeast Asia. So with regard to anthropology, more specifically, I have continued to do work in Malaysia, but then expanded and done substantial amounts of ethnographic research, both in Thailand and now increasingly I'm doing work in Indonesia. So doing sort of comparative research across different Southeast Asian societies. I've also done some research here locally in Singapore as well. But in addition to my ethnographic research, which is mostly based in rural places in Southeast Asia, I've also, since about 2005, 2006, I've done a series of projects with the ASEAN Foundation and then most recently with the ASEAN Secretariat. And these have been a series of research projects which have looked at people's perceptions of Southeast Asia, especially around senses of awareness of ASEAN and senses of orientation towards ASEAN and senses of ASEAN identity and ASEAN values. And basically in all of the projects that I've done, basically done 3 major research projects in 2006, 2014, and 2020. And all of those were projects where I and a team of researchers collected data from across all 10 ASEAN countries. And we focused on, we as our research subjects, as our respondents to a survey that we did, we collected responses from students at universities across Southeast Asia. So at least one university in each of the 10 ASEAN countries. And actually in the second and third iteration of the project, we collected from a variety of several different universities in several countries to get a sense of regional comparisons within countries as well. I'll be talking about that data a little bit in this talk. So over the last 15 or more years, I've been working specifically with these organizations, with ASEAN, the official ASEAN bodies themselves, to try to understand what people's perceptions of ASEAN are and of Southeast Asia are across all of the different 10 countries of ASEAN. So I'll talk a little bit about that in my talk today. And specifically, I'll start off with talking about this issue of how especially Singapore and Singaporeans, from the data that I've collected and other data from other research as well, how Singapore and how people within Singapore sort of think of Singapore's place within Southeast Asia. So the first question that comes up, or one thing to think about, is whether Singapore sees itself as being part of Southeast Asia, or whether it sees itself as being part of East Asia. So in fact, in the first few years that I was here, and I was really, I'd really not spent a lot of time in Singapore. I'd spent a lot of time in Malaysia and some time in Indonesia before I started working at NUS, but I'd actually spent very little time in Singapore itself before I started working and living here in Singapore. And so in my first 3 or 4 years that I was in Singapore, learning more about Singapore society, interacting with students at NUS and many other people within Singapore, I sort of got the impression that Singaporeans sort of felt like they were, say, not so much a part of Southeast Asia, but almost as if Singapore was kind of a bit of East Asia that had kind of broken off and kind of floated down into Southeast Asia, but was really more of like an East Asian society rather than a Southeast Asian society. So had more affinities for, China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, rather than affinities for, the regional neighbors like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth. I've found it then, that was sort of a vague impression that I had. But then when I started doing this research on perceptions of Southeast Asia, I did a particular kind of analysis and collecting a particular kind of data, which I won't go into all the details. It's very technical sort of explanation of exactly how the data is collected and how it's analyzed. But without going into that, what I can tell you is that I did a series of tests, essentially, where I presented students at NUS and then also students in Indonesia, Thailand, and a number of other countries with a domain of countries that included all of the 10 ASEAN countries. So that's Cambodia, or Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. So those 10 ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, along with 5 East Asian countries, which I used China, Japan, Korea, and then also South Korea, North Korea, and Taiwan as East Asian countries, right? So looking at that whole domain of like, East Asian countries, both, what we think of as East Asia or Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia all together. The kind of analysis I did allowed me to produce cognitive maps, that is, maps of how people perceive the relationship among all of these different countries. And what was really interesting to me when I did the analysis, and first of all, show you the analysis that I did for the data from Singapore. So again, this was students from NUS who responded to this, and this was done in 2005. And so the cognitive map that came out of the data that was collected looks like the following. So you hear. So this, what you see on the screen here, is a sort of Singapore cognitive map of East Asia, meaning East and Southeast Asia. And the way, again, without going into too much of the detail of the technicalities of how this analysis is done, but basically in this, if you look at like the distribution of these different dots representing countries, one thing I can tell you, first of all, is that the different sizes of the dots tell you how salient the country is to the respondents. So you can see like the Singapore and Malaysia, and then China, Indonesia, and Thailand are the largest dots. That means those are the countries that for NUS students were the most salient, the most prominent, sort of the most at the top of their minds, so to speak, right? And then the smaller dots like Cambodia, Myanmar, North Korea are the least salient countries. That's not, I mean, the salience here isn't so significant at the moment, but what's most significant here is if you look at the distribution of where all of these countries are, basically the closer that countries are relative to one another, the more that they're considered to be similar to one another, and the more distant they are from one another, the more dissimilar they are. And what you can see is that there's a clear sort of right-left division of 2 general clusters of countries, with the Southeast Asian countries all being clustered on the left-hand side of this map, and East Asian countries being clustered on the right-hand side of this map. And where you can see that Singapore is clearly on the right-hand side of the map, right? I mean, it's a little bit in between Southeast Asia and East Asia, but it's clearly on the like left-right axis of the map is closest to East Asia rather than Southeast Asia. So I actually found this not shocking, but a little surprising and almost amusing that, yeah, actually, in a certain sense, Singaporeans, I mean, this is again NUS students, but certainly, as a subset of Singaporeans, that the NUS students, that Singaporeans see themselves as closer to or more part of East Asia rather than Southeast Asia, right? Now, by comparison, let me show you the map from Thailand. So this is how Thai students sort of perceive the relationship among the countries. You can see here that while Singapore is a little bit like in between the East Asian cluster on the right and the Southeast Asian cluster on the left, Singapore is clearly much more sort of closely associated with Southeast Asia, right? And then on a top to bottom dimension of the map here, you can see how the Thai students, right, see Southeast Asia as divided into sort of a cluster of what we traditionally think of as the mainland Southeast Asian countries, so Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and the maritime Southeast Asian countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore, right? So you get some resolution to that. Whereas if I go back to the Singapore map, right, you can see how, like with the Singapore map on the north-south, I mean, or the top to bottom axis, right? Singapore is sort of very much part of Southeast Asia in the right-left axis, but it is like extremely differentiated from especially North Korea, not surprisingly, on the top bottom axis. And on that top bottom axis, right, if you look at it that way, it's closest, not surprisingly, to Malaysia, with like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar being like the furthest away or the least like Singapore in terms of this whole cluster of East Asian, Southeast Asian countries. So that's first issue around like thinking about Singapore and thinking about the ways that whether or not like people, and especially Singaporeans, sort of think of Singapore as being part of Southeast Asia, right? Again, going back to this question, is Singapore of Southeast Asia? Is it part of Southeast Asia? Or is it simply in Southeast Asia, but really not, very different and not really a part of the region? Kind of, it sort of happens to be in the region, but it's not really part of the region, right? So this is one piece of evidence of, showing at this level of a sort of thinking of Singapore as really not being so much part of Southeast Asia. But again, if you talk to, or if you look at the results from Thailand, and the same is true of Indonesia, Philippines, all of the other countries where in Southeast Asia where I did this, the Southeast Asians, so Thais, Filipinos, Indonesians, Vietnamese, etc., they all see Singapore as very much part of Southeast Asia and more part of Southeast Asia and not part of East Asia. So there's a little bit of a interesting dissonance here where the rest of Southeast Asia clearly sees Singapore as part of Southeast Asia, but Singaporeans themselves kind of have a distance from Southeast Asia and don't really feel necessarily so much part of the region, right? Now, one thing I'll say is that this data was taken in, it goes back to 2005. I haven't repeated this exact study since then. So, I mean, it would be interesting to see if there's been any change in this over the last 15 years or so. But I can say at least in 15 years ago, sort of got this kind of result, right? So that's one thing of like Singapore. And of course, we can understand the reasons for, the vast majority of Singapore as, citizens especially have heritage, have roots that go back to China, right? Identify and think of themselves as being Chinese. And so you can see like there's a strong historical connection to East Asia and specifically to China. So that's, it's very understandable. But there's also other aspects of why Singapore doesn't sort of feel itself strongly connected or part of the region, right? The second aspect of this is the way that Singapore very much is and often sort of sees itself as a global city, right? So, I mean, obviously it's a nation and a city at the same time, but Singapore has a sort of self-perception of being part of a global city and part of, if you look at like a map such as this one, being very much part of a connection to a lot of other global cities, right? So in certain ways, the sort of perception of Singapore, somewhat the self-perception of Singapore, but also the perception of Singapore by, various people around the world, is to sort of think when people think of Singapore, they don't think, oh, that's part of Southeast Asia. Rather, they think, oh yeah, Singapore is a leading global city, right? Connected to London and Tokyo and New York and so forth, right? Sydney, all of these other kind of major global cities, right? So that's a second kind of reason why Singapore kind of sees itself and is often seen as something other than a Southeast Asian society, right? And then another aspect of this as well, which is kind of related to Singapore's status as a global city, is the idea of Singapore being, a first world country. Oh, again, what we mean exactly by first world country is a little bit contested and so forth, but essentially, very modern infrastructure, very wealthy, and so forth, right? So, as famously, one of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs was entitled, From Third World to First, right? Talking about the story of Singapore and Singapore's tremendous economic development from independence in 1965 up until the present, certainly, but, it really, by the mid 1990s, really, Singapore was already, in terms of its economic development, its wealth, its kind of advanced industrial infrastructure and so forth. It really had many of the characteristics of other so-called first world cities, right, or first world countries, whether that's Germany, the United States, Australia, Japan, Korea, South Korea at least, and so forth, right? So Singapore sort of as a first world country. And of course, this is then also related to Singapore's sort of perception of being unique and somewhat different when you look around Southeast Asia, right? So if we look at, and this is a sort of a big chart here, which looks at all of the Southeast Asian countries in terms of these, here's a sort of various data here, but looking at a ranking of them on the World Human Development Index rankings, right? So Human Development Index is an index that tries to incorporate a lot of different sorts of aspects of a country. It's not just wealth, not just the economy, but looks at things like education, health and well-being, life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. And so as of 2019, Singapore ranked number 11 in the world out of, I forget how many total countries, but it's like somewhere between 200 and 250 countries in the world. And Singapore ranked number 11 on this Human Development Index ranking. If you look at like GDP or GNI, which is gross national income per capita, Singapore, in fact, the last time I looked, if you look at this like basically per capita wealth, Singapore, the last time I looked, was number 3 in the world. So Singapore is the 3rd wealthiest country in the world. The only 2 countries, again, last time I looked, the 2 countries that are wealthier than Singapore on GDP per capita are Qatar, which is a Gulf state, right, with oil wealth, and Liechtenstein. So if you know Liechtenstein, Liechtenstein is a tiny, tiny little country, smaller than Brunei, next to Switzerland. And Liechtenstein is basically one big bank with, a few people living in the country. So it's, and both of those countries, Qatar also, I believe, only has something less than 1 million people, right? Whereas Singapore always thinks of itself as small, and certainly in terms of land size, it's quite small. But with 5.5 million people, Singapore is by population the same size as Denmark. And in fact, Denmark within Europe is exactly an average size European country. If you look at all the European countries, of which are 30 or 40 European countries, and you look at how large they are by population, 5.5 million makes you a absolutely average size, or a median size. You're right in the middle of all the European countries in terms of your size. So Singapore, yeah, it's not a large society, but it's also not really a tiny, small society either. And so by that metric, it's really if you look at societies with more than 1 million people, Singapore is the wealthiest society in the world, right? And then if you look at these other, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of years of schooling, right, it's significantly higher than any of our neighbors, right? And, the closest neighbors like Brunei, Malaysia, Thailand, they score pretty well in terms of schooling, in terms of life expectancy. On a global scale, they're all quite good. And in fact, on human development index ranking, in fact, even countries like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and so forth, these days are considered to be medium countries, right? I mean, they're not wealthy countries by any means, but they're certainly not. They're no longer considered, among the poorest of the poor countries in the world, right? They're nothing in terms of, poverty, in terms of things like, places like Africa, some African countries, I think some Latin American countries and so forth, right? That really Southeast Asia has had a long period of relative prosperity and relative peace over many decades now. And that all of these countries on human development index rankings are sort of medium countries. And then, Singapore, Brunei, and Malaysia are all considered very high on overall human development index ranking. But Singapore really is, significantly higher on all of these metrics. So, this is really why, Singapore, again, there's a sort of way in which Singapore is seen and legitimately is, somewhat differentiated from a lot of the other countries of Southeast Asia. Another thing, and this goes back to that original research that I did about, how Singapore perceives or doesn't perceive itself a part of Southeast Asia, and how, the relationship among countries are perceived. One thing that I found in doing that research, which is not unique to Singapore, it actually applies to Malaysia, it applies to Thailand, it applies to Philippines, and so forth, and all of the countries of Southeast Asia, is that when you're asking the respondents to identify, how they see the relationship among countries, there's a very strong tendency to associate your own country upwards in terms of socioeconomic status and prosperity, and dissociate downwards. So in other words, if you take a country like Thailand and the responses from Thailand, right, the Thai respondents will see Thailand as closer to, more similar to, more associated with Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore, which are, wealthier countries than Thailand, but Thailand will see itself as associated with those countries, and kind of dissociated, or more different from slightly less wealthy countries, whether that's Indonesia and Philippines, etc. And again, Filipino students will do the same, or Filipino respondents in the Philippines will do the same, right? Associating sort of upwards with Indonesia or with Thailand, and dissociating from, say, Vietnam or certainly Laos or Cambodia and so forth, right? So that puts Singapore in a very unusual position, because Singapore is, there's no other country in Southeast Asia to associate up with in that sort of sense, right? Excuse me. So Singapore sort of, so the fact that everybody seems to do that, it's not surprising that then Singapore sort of sees itself somewhat different and apart from the other Southeast Asian countries, because of this differentiation in terms of wealth, and then overall sort of factors that go into something like the human development, right? So these are all the reasons why it's sort of not surprising, again, that Singapore often sees itself as kind of, again, being in Southeast Asia, but not necessarily of Southeast Asia, right? When you think of what are typical Southeast Asian societies, right? You think, okay, Indonesia, you think of Thailand, you think of maybe Vietnam, right? These are all Southeast Asian societies. Of course, all of them very unique, all of them have very different sorts of characteristics, but you think, okay, there's things about those countries that sort of make them part of the Southeast Asian mosaic in a way that they're part of Southeast Asia and certainly not really, say, an East Asian country or not a South Asian country, right? Not just by geography, but aspects of the society, such things as, diversity, the sorts of religions that people have, the, languages people speak, and the sorts of economies that those societies have and so forth, right? So what I want to make an argument for, though, is that while Singapore doesn't necessarily see itself as being of Southeast Asia, there are in fact reasons why Singapore is very much a Southeast Asian society, right? That what Singapore is, why Singapore has become the society it is, right, as a wealthy society, all of the things that make Singapore Singapore are factors that I would argue are very much tied to Singapore being part of Southeast Asia, and that it would be very different. It would be a very different society if it were, for example, in East Asia, at least in all likelihood. So I want to talk about some of the sort of historical reasons and social and also economic reasons why Singapore is really very much a part of Southeast Asia and is very much a Southeast Asian society. Not to say that it's like all other Southeast Asian societies. In fact, part of Southeast Asia, part of what makes Southeast Asia a very unique sort of region is the incredible diversity of Southeast Asia. And there's certain ways in which Singapore is very, very much historically and today part of that, you might say, Southeast Asian mosaic. And so the first thing I would point to is one thing that Singapore is, I mean, a big part of what makes Singapore Singapore is that Singapore is the preeminent or the foremost Malacca Straits port. Okay, so if you look at if you look at Southeast Asia, you look at global trade and global trade that's been going on literally for 2,000 years or more, right? The Straits of Malacca have been a very important conduit for global trade for several thousand years. And over that time, there has generally been one, sometimes there are several ports that are important. I mean, usually there are several ports that are important, but there are often like one Malaccan Strait port, which is the predominant or foremost port on the Straits of Malacca. And that particular place has historically been a very wealthy, very cosmopolitan society. So just to go back into history a little bit, right? If you look at world trade and sort of world trade really starts developing as far back as 500 BC, so 2,500 years ago, right? But roughly in the period of 500 BC up till 500 CE, so 500 of the Common Era, or AD, if you use that, basically this is the Christian calendar or the Common calendar, right? So during that period of 500 BCE to 500 CE, that's the period when what we think of as kind of global or world kind of trade really started to get going in a big way. And especially what you had, just historically, was you had around this period, you had the rise of imperial China in the East. You had also the rise of the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. And so you started to get a system of trade where goods were moving all the way from the West in Rome to the East with China. And so Southeast Asia has been a absolutely key center and hub for that trade over these 2,000 or more years that system has developed. Now, in that first kind of 1,000 years, what you had was trade that primarily, I mean, actually, there's lots of debates and arguments over this, but the primary hypothesis, the primary theory and thesis of historians, archaeologists, and others who do work on this, is that in the earliest period, most trade was taking a route. It was called the Trans-Isthmian route. And so if you see that dotted arrow, dotted line that goes, it's going over what's called the Isthmus of Kra. So the Isthmus of Kra is basically what is now kind of right southern Thailand, close to the northern border of Malaysia, right? It's that narrow strip of land that connects Malaysia to the rest of mainland Southeast Asia. And now that Isthmus of Kra, it's very narrow. It's at its narrowest point, it's less than 500 kilometers, or sorry, it's less than 50 kilometers at its narrowest point. And so so in the earliest days of trade, and also sailing technology was much less advanced at that time. And while Austronesians, so people living in the Philippines and Indonesia, those areas of the archipelago of Southeast Asia, actually Austronesians had mastered open ocean sailing prior to this point, but others, Chinese, Indians, Arabs, Persians, and others had not really mastered open ocean sailing and had not mastered the way to use monsoon winds in order to travel over the seas. And so when they traveled by ocean, they were really sort of traveling along the coast, kind of hugging the coast all the way. And what they would do, they would stop on they would bring goods to one or the other side of this Isthmus of Kra, and then they would unload them on one side of the isthmus, transport them over land to the other side of the isthmus, put them on boats on that side, and then transport them onward, either in the direction of China or in the direction of, say, India, and then onward to the Arab Peninsula, Rome, and so forth, right? But starting around 500 CE, and as Austronesians, so these are Malay, Javanese, and others, as the Malays and the Javanese and other Austronesians got more and more involved in this trade, they brought with them, or they sort of brought with them and used, and also other people learned, their sailing technology and their use of the monsoon winds in order to make sailing more efficient. And so basically over time, the use of the Isthmus of Kra declined, and increasingly the goods traveled through the Straits of Malacca, right? And of course, Singapore is located right at the southern tip of, as we all know, of Malaysia, right at the southern tip of the Straits of Malacca. And if you look historically, ever since trade shifted from this using the Isthmus of Kra, that trans-peninsular route over land, shifting to the Malaccan Straits route, ever since then you have a series of major transshipment ports that have become powerful central parts of Southeast Asia. Beginning, and this is a very simplified version of this. The full story of this is much more complicated. There are many different ports involved, but in a very simple way, the first of these major ports was Palembang, and the development of what's known as Srivijaya, which is thought to have kind of controlled the trade in this region for several hundred years. Then for complicated political reasons that I won't go into, but basically Palembang was a dominant port for a long period. That then shifted to Jambi, then for about 100 years shifted to Temasek, right? We all know Temasek, the old name of Singapore. It's actually the Javanese name of Singapore. That's where Temasek comes from. So Temasek was then, Singapore, where we are, was a dominant player for about 100 years. That was followed by Malacca, right? Famous port. And then that was actually followed by Aceh. And then after that, followed by Singapore, right? After Singapore was made, after, you had the founding of the British colony under Raffles, right? And then since that time, Singapore then for the last basically 200 years has been the dominant Straits port in the Straits of Malacca, right? And very much Singapore's kind of success and like what makes Singapore Singapore is being this Malacca Straits port, right? And this is part of sort of Singapore's history or an understanding of Singapore, which I think isn't really emphasized or thought enough about in, say, our own teaching of history and thinking about what Singapore is as a society, right? I mean, Singapore, often the portrayal of Singapore was, well, there was nothing here until, you know, Raffles showed up. Raffles sort of founded the place. And then, you know, 150 years later, Lee Kuan Yew took over and developed the place, right? And that's Singapore, right? But actually Singapore's, so the tradition of what Singapore is goes back a couple thousand years to being a Malacca Straits port. So that's one aspect of it. Now, another very closely related aspect of this is Singapore as a cosmopolitan entreport, right? Or entrepot. So an entrepot is basically a transshipment port. That means a port where goods like come from one place and then move on to another place. So they aren't most of the goods that go through the port of Singapore are not consumed in Singapore. It's a transshipment port, but it's a cosmopolitan entrepot. And so then if you think of that, again, kind of what are the characteristics of a cosmopolitan entrepot, right? Is a place that's very diverse, right? Lots of people coming, lots of people living here, lots of people from different backgrounds, different languages, etc., right? And if you look at like Singapore is like this, but this is very, very characteristic of many Southeast Asian societies and many Southeast Asian cities, right? Whether you look at Bangkok or Manila or Jakarta and so on, right? All of these cities are very diverse and are entrepot cities where you have, you know, often there's like one ethnic group, like in Thailand and Bangkok, obviously Thais are the predominant group, but it's also a very cosmopolitan and diverse city. There's lots of people from all over the world from different places in Bangkok or also in Jakarta or in Manila and so forth, right? And especially if you compare that to East Asian societies, right, which tend to be much more homogenous, right? Whether it's China, Japan, Korea, etc., tend to be ethnically and linguistically much more homogenous societies rather than diverse, multilinguist, multi-ethnic societies, right? So again, that's another aspect of what makes Singapore really very much a Southeast Asian more so than an East Asian, for example, society. Another part of like thinking about what makes Singapore very Southeast Asian is thinking about Singapore's place in terms of the nonyoung Chinese community. Remember I'm using the term nonyoung, right? Nonyoung meaning sort of the Southeast Asia, right? Is a, you know, nonyoung is a Chinese term that refers to the southeast of China, the Southeast Asia. And so if you look again at the history of Southeast Asia, nonyoung Chinese, and so I'm referring to sort of communities of people from China who then come and settle and really establish themselves as communities within Southeast Asia. This has a long history within the history of Southeast Asia, right? So you can find pretty clear evidence of, you know, not just sort of individual merchants or traders sort of coming and then going back to China, but really communities of people from China coming to Southeast Asia and laying down roots, so to speak, establishing communities within Southeast Asia. You can find pretty clear evidence of this going back to at least 200 CE, so almost 2,000 years ago, right? Now, you know, there's all kinds of different characteristics of these, all kinds of different histories, right? I mean, there's very different histories at very different times in different places of, you know, in relationship to other communities in Southeast Asia, of, you know, integration, you know, of course, you know, famously the Peranakan Chinese communities that very much, you know, take on aspects of, say, Malay or other kind of local culture. Also the integration in Thailand, where, you know, Sino-Thai and Thai individuals, you know, are almost indistinguishable. And then also various aspects of cooperation, and certainly, aspects of conflict, times when there have been very, periods of extreme conflict problems between, Chinese communities and local communities, whether they're, for example, in Malaysia, with, Malay-Chinese conflicts sometimes, or in Indonesian with Indonesian-Chinese conflicts, also in Vietnam, right? But, conflict is not the only mode. In fact, integration and cooperation tends to be more common than conflict in Southeast Asia. And so one thing that Singapore has become is really a center for nonyoung Chinese within Southeast Asia. And again, that makes it very much, I would argue, a part of Southeast Asia and having a particular and special kind of place within Southeast Asia. All right, so what I've laid out there is a number of reasons to really think about Singapore as being very much of Southeast Asia and a Southeast Asian society, right? So now I'll just say a few words, and I want to have time for question and answer, so I'll go over this fairly quickly. But a few words about thinking about the place of Singapore in ASEAN, right? And Singapore's relationship to ASEAN, and the importance both of ASEAN to Singapore and Singapore to ASEAN. So just, and again, I'll just make a few brief comments about this and we can discuss it more. And if we have questions, we can discuss them, right? But if you think about Singapore's role in ASEAN, right? Going back to 1967, when ASEAN was founded, right? Singapore was, of course, along with Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, one of the 5 original members of ASEAN, right? And ever since that time, ASEAN has really been an important forum for regional issues, right? For things like, I mean, one of the examples, if people remember this, it hasn't been such of a problem lately, but we've had some real problems with haze in the past, in the last decade or two, where we have the haze problem of, haze from Indonesia coming over and affecting Malaysia and Singapore. So ASEAN then becomes an important forum for sort of dealing with those kinds of regional issues. But beyond that, ASEAN's really developed itself to develop a particular kind of regional character and a particular kind of regional internationalism, right? This is often referred to as the ASEAN way. And I won't go into this, again, for time purposes, I can't explain this in great detail. But the thing that I would argue here is, if you look at like literature on internationalism and on regionalism, right? Looking at different regions of the world, whether it's East Asia, Europe, etc. ASEAN is probably, arguably, next to or along with the EU, with the European Union, probably the most substantial and the most long-lasting kind of regional organization that exists in the world. And so this sort of, these kinds of international regional organizations, they exist at this level, like, below them, so to speak, or at a lower scale, you have nation states, right? And then at a global scale, you have something like the United Nations, but then these are regional organizations. And ASEAN has developed a very specific kind of regional approach to international relations. And a lot of the literature on this often looks at ASEAN as being sort of, is critical of ASEAN often for being weak or ineffective, and often compares it to the EU and looks at sort of the EU versus ASEAN and how the two different bodies function. I think that there's a really very problematic critiques of ASEAN, because ASEAN has developed a very different and very unique form of internationalism and regionalism, which is really quite different than the EU. And the way that I would characterize this is to say that the model of the EU, the model of the European Union, is basically the nation state writ large. So if you think of what a nation state is, the sort of theory behind the nation state is that you have a nation, a group of people, and that particular singular group of people has their own state. So, Germany is for Germans and France is for French and so forth. And then the European Union, there's a sort of common sense of everybody being European, and therefore, European Union is for the Europeans. But ASEAN is not a nation state writ large. I would argue that ASEAN is a plural society writ large. And so a plural society is one in which you have many people interacting. So socially, they're part of the same society. They're interacting, living together, cooperating, but are distinct, different people, right? Consider themselves sort of uniquely separate people and function together in a way that everybody doesn't have to assimilate to one norm, but can maintain a degree of their own sense of identity. Now, Singapore itself is a classic example of plural society in terms of having strong senses of sort of Malay identity, Indian identity, Eurasian identity, Peranakan identity, and of course, Chinese identity. All of these different communities, of course, being Singaporean, but at the same time, sort of not having to assimilate to a singular Singaporean norm, right? The same is true of Indonesia. The same is very much true of Malaysia, right? And even to some extent, places like Thailand, certainly the Philippines and so forth. So again, Southeast Asia is made up of plural societies, and ASEAN regionalism and internationalism is built on that kind of plural society model. And so what's very important in that plural societies model is that people learn to cooperate, work together, and so forth, but not at the cost of losing individual autonomy and losing individual identity. And so that's been a very important part of ASEAN, is to support Singapore being Singapore and support Malaysia being Malaysia and Thailand being Thai, as opposed to the European Union, where the theory is everybody needs to follow singularly European norms. And again, we can talk more about that if there's time for a little Q&A. All right, so let me just wrap this up here to say that, the sort of case that I've made here is a case for thinking of Singapore more self-consciously as being part of Southeast Asia. Certainly being unique, not being like every other Southeast Asian society, but that's exactly what Southeast Asia is. It's a collection of societies that have all developed in very unique and autonomous ways and haven't been sort of dominated by a centralizing force. And if you look around other regions of the world, whether it's East Asia and the effect of like Chinese characters and the use of Chinese characters in writing and sort of Confucian and Chinese values and sort of how those have been part of, incorporating into Japan and Korea and elsewhere. Or if you look at Europe, the way that Europe developed and the sort of centralizing force of Christianity and historically like the Roman Empire and so forth, the spread of Latin as a language. Or if you look at the Middle East and the like important sort of centralizing force of Islam and caliphates and so forth, in all of those regions, right, they've sort of developed a singular identity developed on centralizing forces, whereas Southeast Asia has developed in a way where there's been a production for a variety of reasons of diversity rather of singularity, right? So I think there's reason to argue that, like, to sort of think of ways that Singapore itself can think of itself as more self-consciously having an orientation towards Southeast Asia, right? Not separating from Southeast Asia as, it's not to say don't think of Singapore as a global city, don't think of Singapore as first world, that's fine, but also think of the ways that Singapore really is part of Southeast Asia. And then furthermore, think of the ways in which, Singapore can use its resources, especially its financial resources, intellectual resources, and so forth, to really promote regional development and prosperity in Southeast Asia, and the ways in which, Singapore's success, again, as a Malaccan Straits port, as a place that has been, has relied a lot on, labor of like Thai construction workers, of, domestic workers from around the region and so forth. All of these things that have like made Singapore a successful, wealthy, prosperous society very much have sort of relied on the success of ASEAN. And so I think, these are all reasons for Singapore itself and Singaporeans themselves to think of ways in which Singapore really needs to continue to self-consciously, and maybe more than it has in the past, self-consciously think of itself as a part of Southeast Asia and more specifically, institutionally, a part of ASEAN. All right, I think we have about 5 minutes left there. So I will leave that there, and I'm not sure if the moderator wants to.
All right, thank you, Prof. So if anyone has any question, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat, and then I'll just read it out loud for everyone. Okay, so if you have any questions, please go ahead.
John, yep, you want to go ahead and ask?
Hello, hi, Professor Thompson. Thank you for the seminar. This is very, very informative. I just want to take up on your point about how Singapore can move forward. And I'm wondering, for example, your third point here on the slide, Singapore's success, portraying Singapore's success as being reliant on ASEAN's success. Is there some kind of other lessons that we can learn from the European experience about how that, because the way I see it, it seems to be a narrative. So is there something that we can learn from the European process where the narrative helps to shape that kind of identity?
Right. I'm not, I mean, to be honest, I mean, I think that, of course, one can look at things that, you know, initiatives, things that have been done in Europe or in the European Union in terms of, you know, potentially successful, potentially useful sorts of models and so forth. However, I think it's more important to really think about, you know, Southeast Asia, to learn more about sort of the history of Southeast Asia, like what has made Southeast Asia successful and prosperous, and what points of time have like really devastated Southeast Asia or made it like less prosperous. I mean, one of the major reasons, I mean, of course, in, you know, historically in Southeast Asia, a couple of the reasons why Southeast Asia has been perceived, even though it's increasingly prosperous on a world scale, you know, there were a couple of things. One is, you know, of course, the effects of colonialism, which was not particularly positive for Southeast Asia. Another was the effects of the Second World War, which was really devastating. And one of the things that happened to Southeast Asia was that you had two crises that happened right back to back. You had the Great Depression in the 1930s, right? And a lot of Southeast Asia, I mean, the whole globe was hit by an incredibly bad economic recession, depression, right? However, if you look at the details of this, by the late 1930s, Southeast Asia was actually starting to recover. And actually, if you look at the colonial period, I mean, obviously colonialism was very problematic. Obviously, I mean, there's no doubt about that. But Southeast Asia, along with the rest of the world, was undergoing sort of modernity, modernization, becoming more industrialized, becoming more urbanized also. But the problem with modernity, which like modernity basically happens in the 19th and early 20th century, you know, the world goes from being a pre-modern to a modern world. But most of Southeast Asia, in fact, I would argue all of Southeast Asia, even though Thailand was relatively independent, but still had to deal with colonial powers, right? As the economy developed, it developed in a way that was very much geared towards the greater industrialization of Europe, with just extracting raw materials, and it wasn't really benefiting Southeast Asia in the way that it sort of properly should in a way. But then the other thing that happened was, you know, World War II, and that was actually more devastating than the Depression. And about half of the Southeast Asian societies, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, also Indonesia, also Myanmar to a small degree, right, really had to struggle to obtain independence, especially Vietnam, right? It was really devastated by about 3 decades of war to gain its own independence. Singapore was incredibly fortunate in that there was a sort of peaceful handover of British rule to, you know, Malaysian and then Singaporean rule, right? But if you look at like what is important. I mean, all throughout Southeast Asia's very long, several thousand years of history, one key thing is maintaining peace, right? Maintaining peaceful relationships among the many different nations of Southeast Asia or societies of Southeast Asia. A second one is trade and commerce. One thing that really devastated and caused, you might be surprised to know that after the Second World War in the 1950s, besides Singapore, the most industrialized country in Southeast Asia was the Philippines. What happens to the Philippines? Well, there was an idea in the post-colonial era that what you should have is an economic system called import substitution, which means that you have very high tariffs and taxes. You don't have a lot of international trade, and you try to develop just your local industries, right? That was a really bad move for Southeast Asia, because what's always made Southeast Asia prosperous is international trade. It's a place where international trade is the key to prosperity. So keeping the region peaceful and keeping a strong sort of open international trade system going are really key things. And you wouldn't necessarily learn that from European history, but you'd certainly learn it from Southeast Asian history. So again, my suggestion is, I think there's a real place in Singapore to really learn more about what makes Southeast Asia prosperous, because that's ultimately what's going to make Singapore. Thanks for the question.
All right. Do we have another question? Maybe we have time for one or two more.
If there's no other question, maybe I'll add one more question. No,
Sure.
oh, I think that's Joshua. Joshua's made one question in the chat.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So Joshua, I'll just say, so you said that there's some contrast between Southeast Asia and European regionalism in terms of identity formation. So does ASEAN have the potential for a future model for yes, I would. So the question is, is ASEAN potentially a model for a kind of non-Western form of regionalism? And I think definitely, I think that people should look more to the ASEAN model. Again, I would not say that the ASEAN model is perfect and always, achieves the best results, but neither is the European model perfect and achieves the best results. But I think what's very powerful about the ASEAN model is it is a very distinct, different model of regionalism, which puts a lot of emphasis on national autonomy. The idea is that ASEAN is not here to override Singapore or Thailand or Myanmar's sort of national autonomy, but rather to support it. Now, with the case of Myanmar, right? That's always been something that's been kind of problematic and criticized, and people often say, well, ASEAN needs to do more in Myanmar. On the other hand, you have, like the United States or European Union that takes the approach of like sort of sanctioning and punishing Myanmar, for which there's arguments to be made. But the ASEAN approach is to try to have constructive engagement, right? And to support independence and national autonomy. And I think there's a lot, I think that the ASEAN model definitely could and should be looked to more for, how it works and how it functions and what its principles are, which are quite different than the principles of the European Union. I think there's maybe one more. Yeah, I'll answer this one more question from the chat here, Isabel. Curious about the politics of Southeast Asia, since you feel that the Singapore political climate is quite different than that of our neighbors, might contribute to the way, you're right. Right, okay, one thing, yes, Singapore is relatively, no society is 100% free of corruption, but Singapore probably comes closer than any society on earth of being free from corruption. So yes, that's something that makes it quite different than most of the rest of Southeast Asia, which has a lot of problems with corruption. Although, that's something that think that, the rest of Southeast Asia would do very well to kind of try to look to the Singapore model of how do you get rid of corruption in society, which is not an easy thing to do. Another thing about this, though, again, one of the aspects, this is one of the aspects of really understanding what Southeast Asia is that Southeast Asia is incredibly diverse. It's sometimes, one can look at it as kind of an oxymoron or a contradiction to say that you have something like unity and diversity, or what makes Southeast Asian societies so similar to one another is that they're so different. But that really is an actual accurate portrayal of Southeast Asia, is there's a lot of diversity. That includes a lot of diversity of different political systems. On the other hand, one of the things that we don't, we look to different societies, we look to the different countries and we say, well, some are more democratic, some are less democratic, they have all kinds of different systems. Singapore has a particular kind of democracy. Actually, what's interesting, there's an argument to be made that Singapore's type of democracy is actually similar to Vietnam's form of democracy. That's a anyway, that's a long and maybe complicated and fraught subject, but there's a certain sort of, there's a sort of controlled democratic system in Singapore, you might say. There's sort of a more open-ended, contentious democratic system in, say, Indonesia or the Philippines and so forth, in Thailand. But one of the things that they all share is a commitment, at least, somewhat commitment to constitutionalism. And that's a thing that's sort of not really talked about a lot, but the way in which the idea of a constitution and sort of fundamentally an orientation and a set of values that stick to a kind of rule of law, which is not always the case and not always maintained, but it's certainly a certain thing that is shared. It's kind of shared globally, but certainly shared throughout Southeast Asia. Okay, there's maybe one more question I have time for here.
Yeah.
The EU versus ASEAN comparison brought the influence of the regional security geopolitical concerns to mind, especially the developments of Europe. What are your thoughts on the comparative significance of NATO for the EU and the 5-power defense arrangement? That's an interesting one. ASEAN itself started, ASEAN actually has 3 pillars, right? So ASEAN's 3 pillars are, the first pillar is security, which includes sort of defense and regional security, and trying to maintain a zone of peace, and avoid war and certainly conflict between ASEAN countries. But then the others are, the first pillar is security, the second is economic cooperation, and the third is social and cultural cooperation. So security has been a major issue for ASEAN throughout its history. ASEAN is in, none of the ASEAN countries themselves are, so-called great powers, right? We have a very powerful neighbor in China. And then we have, strong affiliations with, between Singapore and the United States in certain ways, right? So, yeah, ASEAN certainly doesn't have NATO, but it does have, this has always been a concern for Southeast Asia and for ASEAN, is like trying to make sure that like none of the great powers get involved in the region, and certainly want to avoid, first and foremost, above all, perhaps, a calamity like what happened with the Second World War, which really devastated Southeast Asia and took a very long time, still has like not fully recovered from. Also, of course, the experience of colonialism, of being dominated by distant foreign powers, right? All of that, all of that is really the first and foremost, or the original kind of primary reason for the development of ASEAN. So what you do about that, it's not easy, but certainly having, let me just say, part of the reason again for ASEAN and part of the intention of ASEAN is to have mutual support among all of its members, because no individual ASEAN country can have sort of strong standing vis-a-vis, say, China, the United States, or even say Japan. But by cooperating together, it allows the organization in the region as a whole to kind of balance kind of regional cooperation against these sort of various other powerful countries, right? I mean, Singapore is economically powerful, but very small. Indonesia is a huge country, but it's not very economically powerful, right? So there's no one in ASEAN. So that's the kind of idea of banding together. All right, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for your insights, and thank you everyone for attending and also for asking the questions. So now I'll just share the screen. All right, so if you'd like to check out the ASEAN Corner, it's on level 5 at the Singapore Malaysia Collection, as Prof mentioned earlier. Thank you for attending. Rani, you can stop the recording right now. Thank you.